What's up, lads? It's your boy Remo here, ready for another balance feedback video. Last night, out of nowhere, the new PTR patch dropped 1.32.10, and it includes quite a few balance changes. We're all caught by surprise by the small patch, but yeah, there are some balance changes involved. And we're gonna get into them here in this video. We're gonna go through it step by step and go through this blue post here by Blizzard. Initially, I'm gonna say, I think a lot of the patch does things right and with good intentions, but there's also a lot of dangerous things in there which I think have to be addressed again, and also quite a few things that have been left unaddressed. But we'll go through it step by step here and go through this most recent post, now 12 hours old. Last night we saw it, and there was a mad scramble going on, and the excitement was high, so I wanted to wait for my mind to have a night of sleep to rest and consider these again. And yeah, I think now I have a pretty good grasp of what is going on. But without too much further ado, let's go in and take a look. I'll be, of course, linking the URL to this post, so you can read it up yourself at your own pace if you like, in the description below. So a bit of an introduction here, you know, the usual blah blah, we're still working on it. They're saying that a ladder is still coming, they're committed to it, which is more decisive words than we're sometimes used to from Blizzard. And also they're saying they're expecting this PTR to be going live in mid-April. And if you remember the last PTRs, they initially came up with some suggestions, the community gave feedback, and then they retracted some of them. They added some other ones. And yeah, so I kind of think that's what we have to expect here as well. Until mid-April, there might be some changes still coming to this PTR. In fact, likely changes will be coming to this PTR and some other iterations. Also, they're mentioning human versus undead, which is definitely the most important problematic matchup in the current meta. That is definitely right. I made some notes here to myself as well, sort of a script to go through here, because I think there's a lot of things to cover. Alright, so first things first, introduction out of the way, whatever. We want to go into the meat and potatoes here of the balance, but let's wait a second here. There's some things I think we should try to keep in mind here before we really hop into it. So firstly, we need to keep in mind that this game has to be balanced around the pro players. The highest level of play is the most important level there is, and the game has to be balanced around those. That means the top 20, top 15, top 10 players in the world. The very best. The WGL winners, the ESL Pro Tour players, these guys. And they are, in some ways, ahead of the meta. Oftentimes, they lead the way, and then the rest of the scene follows. So we have to make changes with this top player scene in mind, and with most recent events in mind. I'm of course addressing ESL Pro Tour or DreamHack Regional Finals, where we saw some interesting things, and we're gonna get into that later. So, PTR balance patch, right? We've been waiting for it for a long time, especially the humans. And the question is, what should this address? What should this PTR address, and what is it going to be addressing? In my opinion, there's three important issues at the moment in the meta that have to be addressed / corrected. One of them, of course, is Undead versus Human. We all know that it has been imbalanced for a long time, especially the Crypt Lord nowadays. The DK Fiend strategy seems to be pretty balanced with the rest of the game, or the human race, but the Crypt Lord definitely is too strong. We all know that. That's point one, Undead versus Human. Point two, Human versus Night Elf, ultra late game. Night Elves have become better at dealing with human. They've had a lot of issues with that matchup for a long time. But in the ultra late game, at 80 supply, when the human is fully upgraded, that is where Night Elf has really big problems and can oftentimes feel without chances when the human comes to his full power anime style. I'm gonna get into that later as well. So that's the second problem. Ultra late game for Night Elf versus human. Is that gonna be addressed? It's going to be the second point. And the third one, and this is the most recent one that sprang into the meta, is Orc being a bit too cost efficient nowadays. We especially saw this demonstrated in the matchup Orc versus Night Elf. Last year, and the 2 years before, I guess, Night Elf versus Orc was greatly in the Night Elf's favor. But this has completely flipped. Over the last half year or so, Orc has gotten better and better and stronger and stronger. The players have gotten stronger, but also the race itself in terms of numerical values. With the Great Hall change and the mirror image and the Wisp nerf, especially in the case of Night Elf, Orc has become really good. Orc is almost looking oppressive in tournaments. If we look towards Asia, Orcs are always there in the top 4, strongly represented. We oftentimes have 3 Orcs in the top 4. So Orc seems to be a little too good at the moment across the board. Not by much, but a little bit. So that's point 3. Orc being a bit too cost efficient nowadays in the meta on the top level. Alright. And one more thing I want to mention here before we get into the changes themselves. We need to be careful with these. Just because a matchup is looking imbalanced in one way doesn't mean that you want to be nerfing the favored race with 5 nerfs and want to be buffing the unfavored race with 5 buffs. Too many buffs, too many nerfs can quickly whack a matchup out of balance just as badly as it was before. This might be the case at the moment in Night Elf versus Orc, although it might still be a little bit too early to tell. But what that matchup certainly showed us, Orc versus Night Elf, where Orc was unfavored before, is a few changes can make a big difference. And, jumping ahead a little bit, I think we might be going a little too heavy on the buffs and nerfs on this one. So I think these are some important thoughts to keep in mind as we now approach the changes themselves. Here we go. Gonna try to not make this a 2-hour video this time, by the way. I'm gonna try to be a little bit brisker. Alrighty, so let's hop into it. We start with human right away. Probably the most important part of this balance patch, the human versus undead matchup. Improved lumber tech requirement removed. Advanced lumber tech requirement changed from castle to keep. Alright, so this means that improved lumber used to be able to be done on tier 2 and advanced lumber on tier 3. That's how it was, right? But now in the PTR, they want to make it so that improved lumber can be researched right away. It doesn't need tier 2. And advanced lumber can be researched on tier 2 rather than tier 3. With advanced lumber and improved lumber, peasants can carry more lumber. The way it works is the same. Developer's note says, in a human versus undead matchup, the human player is generally expected to lose some peasants throughout the early and mid game. The human player also must invest in a lot of wood for early defense and use militia frequently to defend, which causes them to have gold to wood ration imbalances. This change should help human players balance their economy and make it slightly easier to transition into the later part of the game and unlock key units against undead. Now, this does make sense on paper, but there's a little bit more to it than just saying, well, human could use more lumber, and then they would have an easier time against undead, and that would help them out. It's not that simple. So, first of all, this is a big human buff overall. We want to buff human against undead, not against the other races. Human versus orc is probably perfectly balanced right now, and human is a little favored against Night Elf. So a buff across the board is not the right approach. That's the first issue. Also, the way it's trying to address the issue is against undead, and here it might not even work. The problem for human is starting the tier 1 tech. Once the tier 1 tech is started, then you usually get to tier 3 right away. You can normally afford that. You keep on making peasants at the expansion, and so on and so on. But if you're fast expanding, you are never making the lumber mill plus the lumber upgrade before the tier 2 tech starts. You don't have the resources. It's too inefficient. If you're going for a fast expansion with AM creeping level 3, getting the fast expo up, it's about saving peasants and all that stuff, or with Mountain King for that matter. But until the expo is up, and until your tech starts, you're not making a lumber mill. You're not making the lumber upgrade. You're just making peasants and footies. 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 And then when the tier 2 tech starts, then you add the lumber mill. Maybe some towers, maybe a shop. Probably both of them. But then you add a lumber mill, and then you start getting the lumber upgrades. But the problem against undead is, first, getting to that tech timing. When the tier 2 tech finally starts, getting to that timing. And here, that lumber mill doesn't help at all. because you cannot afford the lumber mill and the upgrade before you start the tier 2 tech. So this is a misplaced change, really. It doesn't really help in the problematic matchup against Undead, and it is just a buff for human across the board, which is not the way you want to do it. We saw this in previous patches as well, where Blizzard sometimes looks at a problematic matchup, tries to buff the unfavored race, but they ignore the other matchups where this is going to be too strong. And the other matchup where this is especially, potentially, too strong is against Night Elf. In the ultra late game against Night Elf, human is already favored, as I said. They have extremely strong triple hero, and they have extremely strong spells with Clap and Slow and Inner Fire. Night Elves have good Orb and pretty weak spells from heroes and units, pretty weak spells. And they have the only advantage they have is better upgrades. With bears, chimps, fairies, and mountain giants all benefiting from the same upgrades, and dryads, the only advantage they have is better upgrades. With this change, human can keep up and catch up in upgrades way better. So they're taking away, potentially with this change, the only edge that Night Elf has late game. Or one of the very few advantages that Night Elf has late game. So this could very well exacerbate the problem of human versus Night Elf ultra late game. So this is a problematic change. I'm really not sure that this is a good one to implement at all. I get that we're trying to help human with the lumber. They have problem with lumber, but you have to think about the ramifications. This has wide-reaching consequences. And also, as I pointed out, it doesn't really help against Undead, because it's about reaching that, starting the tier 2 tech as fast as possible. That is the problem. And this doesn't help with that. This does not help with the problem. So I really don't think this is a very good change at all. But okay. That's my thoughts on the first one. Next up we have Knights. Now have Sundering Blades by default. So this is of course intended to help, again, the problematic matchup versus Undead. And I think this is very good. Oftentimes it's about the Undead pushing the human expansion, and the human just barely doesn't have enough, just that little bit is missing. He gets the Knights and he's trying to come through to break through the expansion and push back the Undead. And this is certainly going to be helping with that one. It's going to be increasing or improving the timing a little bit. The good thing about this change is the Sundering Blades is available earlier, so it helps human get to their power spike earlier, but it doesn't make them too strong in the ultra late game. At 80 supply, fully upgraded, human is really strong. And there the strength remains the same. It just helps with the timing. It helps especially against the Undead timing push, which I think is good, because the more you incentivize 2 base play and less of these all-in push strategies, usually also the better the game becomes. So this might incentivize more Undeads going to 2 base rather than just all-in pushing. A good development for the game. Now, one thing to be said here is, this does look a little bit scary against Night Elf, because a lot of Night Elves for a while were playing Mountain Giants and Archers, but actually, and here we have to keep the pro players in mind again, most recently most Night Elves have been moving away from that style. They've been playing a lot more Bears, possibly Chimps, possibly Fairy Dragons. And also, on the pro level, usually that matchup, Night Elf versus Human, ends up being 2 base, and there the timing advantage is not so important of the Sundering Blades being there by default. So I think it should be really fine against Night Elf. And yeah, it's good against Undead where it's sort of needed. So I really like this change. I think this is a very good one. And in addition, that's a bonus, this might help also in Human Mirror to incentivize more Knight play, more tier 3 play, leading away from Mass Breakers. So I think this is a very, very good change indeed. Really like this one. Next, coming up, we have the Priest Dispel range increase from 600 to 700. I guess we didn't read the patch notes. Let's do it. The developer's notes. With the addition of Sundering Blades passive, we've really seen a lot more Knight usage, and we like that a lot. However, it takes a long time for Knights to come online with their multiple upgrades. We feel that allowing Sundering Blades to be on Knights by default allows them to have an immediate impact when built, while giving them some uniqueness as a heavy late-game unit. Yeah, I like this. Whenever Tier 3 is incentivized and Tier 3 units are improved, I think is a good development. If games are stuck on Tier 2, it's oftentimes a little dull. Yeah, as I said, I think this is a very good change overall. Moving on to priests. So, priests are kind of weird. Priests are very clunky. Priests are a little frustrating to deal with if you are the player. They have some very old coding, some very old AI. They keep on standing still. They don't use their spells. We all know the meme, despool, despool. So, this is intended to help with that clunkiness. And this one should help as well, you know? If you're trying to dispel something, the priest out of range, the priest walks forward, he dies, it's very annoying. And I think that's also what they're saying in the developer's notes. Changes to the overall meta have moved players towards favoring range units in certain matchups. True, piercing damage meta, still fairly prevalent. We noticed that whenever a priest would try to cast Dispel, they would immediately get focused down by piercing damage units and be killed immediately. This slight increase in range should improve the usability and quality of life for the priest. Yeah, I agree. Makes a lot of sense. Also, another benefit here is this helps against Necro Wagon pushes a little bit. Not very much, but Necro Wagon pushes are extremely annoying, extremely unfun. And some of you guys may know I have been trying to campaign against them. This helps a little bit. Very good change in my opinion. Yeah, that's all about the priest change. Now we come to the towers, and this is a bit of a controversial one. I've already seen lots of discussion here. The developer notes say this was a change we tested in a previous PTR but pulled away from to see how the previous patch performed. Since then we've seen players shift to more ranged units, and we feel this change is needed to help human defend against certain pushes. Certainly currently even if a human reacts immediately to a threat with a handful of peasants, it is still not enough to prevent their towers from going down. Now, they saw some issues with towers not being able to defend an expansion. And I suppose that must mean the matchup of Undead versus Human. Because Human versus Night Elf, usually it works out pretty well, and archers aren't a problem nowadays anymore, really. So this must be addressing Undead, where they see more piercing damage now, which is kind of weird, because Undead has been playing Fiends for literal years, and it is their staple. But whatever. It is a buff to Human, but again, it's not just a buff to Human against Undead where it's needed, it's also a buff to Human against Night Elf, and against Orc, anywhere. It can be a buff, so this again, I don't think hits the nail on the head. And much more importantly, this could be problematic. Many of you remember the meta was plagued by tower pushes for years, and we don't want to go back to that misery. And we have to keep in mind here, this is not the first buff that could encourage this kind of play again. Excuse me. This tower repair rate would obviously buff tower pushes. Also, last patch we had an increase of peasant HP by 10, which I think was very good and very appropriate. But if we increase tower strength, we increase tower push possibilities. And that is a very annoying part of the game that we do not want to see return. And as far as the matchup against Undead is concerned specifically, Human is already getting a lot of significant buffs if these go through. And as I said before, we don't want to overdo it. If we try to balance the scales too much by nerfing one heavily and buffing the other one heavily, we might end up with just as imbalanced of a situation. So this is a very dangerous change, especially as far as tower push meta is concerned. This is very risky. I wouldn't say it's a horrible change, but it's a very risky one that is not required, in my opinion. Moving on to the Siege Engine, aka the tank. Experience bounty reduced from 85 to 60. So, in one of the more recent balance patches, experience bounty was increased from 60 to 85 to make tanks give more experience when you kill them. Of course, they are extremely tanky. They have 700 HP and fortified armor. Very hard to take out for anybody but Orc, who can do it easily with Raiders. Extremely tough to take out units and extremely annoying as well. The developer notes say, while we wanted to reduce the overall effectiveness of certain siege engine strategies, realized that due to the inflexibility of our experience leveling system, setting the bounty at 85 was too high. There has been some ongoing community sentiment that tanks were in a good place previously, so we've reduced the experience bounty. We will continue to monitor this and may test additional changes in lieu of this one. So, was too high. That's an interesting point to bring up. So, 700 HP fortified armor gives 85 experience. That's too high. Too high. So, that means tanks are so easy to kill that 85 experience is too much. So you want to make it 60 experience. So that basically says tanks are just as easy to kill as fiends and huntresses and rifles and grunts. For lack of a better word, I must say I feel that's silly. I feel that's pretty silly. Tanks are for supply. Tanks are extremely hard to kill. 85 experience seems exactly right. In fact, you could make the argument that it's too low. What else gives 85 experience? A-bombs give 85 experience. They're easier to kill than tanks. Bears give 85 experience. They're easier to kill than tanks. They're also more expensive, by the way. Knights give 85 experience. And Kodos, they're easier to kill. And you know what? Griffins and Windriders also give 85 experience. And they're way easier to kill. So, I think this makes no sense at all. 85 experience for a tank was proper. And also, who has been saying that tanks were in a good place before? Tanks have been ruining games and making the game very unfun for a really long time. I can still think back to not long ago, 1 year ago on Terranostan, when we used to see 20 tanks every game, human versus night elf. That is not fun. That is not an enjoyable experience. As a viewer, well, you could argue, some people have different tastes, but as a player, it's horrible. I think the increase in experience was actually perfect, from 60 to 85. I think it was perfect. In fact, we still saw tanks sometimes, but rarely, which is the way you want to have it with a very frustrating unit. You don't want it to be played extremely often to ruin a game experience regularly, but every now and then seeing them, kind of like a Tower Lord, Fire Lord Tower Rush, every blue moon, every couple of months is sort of nice. But you don't want to encourage it a lot of the time. And yeah, speaking of encouraging more tank play is like encouraging more Necro Wagon or Liquid Fire Batrider play. It's extremely unfun and non-enjoyable. It just straight up worsens the game. Tanks are part of the game, yes, but please, let's make sure they remain a rare part of the game. We don't want to have cancerous strategies rising to prominence. So I think this is a very bad change. I think this is the first very bad change that they introduce, and I think this really should be reverted. This is, first of all, it's not a balance problem. Making tanks better doesn't help with any balance problems, really, because normally human dies against undead before they can ever get to tanks. This just makes games worse. This just worsens our scene, if I want to be dramatic. But yeah, this makes the game worse overall in terms of user experience. Really dislike this one. Alright, we come to the one single Night Elf change, which is interesting. Druid of the Claw starting mana increased from 100 to 125. The developer's notes say, a small quality of life change that was requested by the community, which also helps Master Bears have slightly more utility right away. So, a couple of things about this. A bit of worrying here is that this could force the usually diverse Night Elf race and their strategies down a more streamlined path. With bears having this buff, they suddenly seem really good, and maybe we're going to see less unit variety because of that coming up. So that's one issue here. The other is, this doesn't really help the problems currently, which are mid-game versus Orc, where Orc is oftentimes overwhelming them, and ultra-late game versus Human. Against Orc, in the mid-game, if you're trying to go to Bears, it doesn't matter if they're stronger. You're gonna die. And Bears are still bad against Orc, so you can forget about Bears against Orc. This doesn't help. Not on the top level, anyways. In an ultra late game versus Human, if you are at an 80 supply with high hero levels, the Bears having a bit more mana doesn't really help you there either. So it doesn't address the issues of Night Elf. And yeah, it is a change that honestly I was really fond of as well before. Like, I don't know, half a year to a year ago, I thought this would be a really good idea. To, you know, the Bear is the only spellcaster melee unit, so it goes in line with their characteristics, with their personality. They have a bit more mana, they can use more spells. It seemed to make sense. But that was before the Bears were massively buffed again. Their damage was increased twice again. So now they have lots of damage, and they have even more mana. When they were weaker, when they had less damage, I thought this would make more sense. But now, this might be a bit too much. And, compoundingly here, this might be buffing them too much where it's not desired. Because in the matchup, in the mirror matchup, this might just lead to pure mass Bear play now. Just to Bear mirror every game, which is kind of a shame. And also, in the matchup against Undead, this might mean lots of rejuves for the Demon Hunter over and over, and they're being too strong in the mid-game. So also here, I'm not sure that this is going to be really helping where it's needed. Late game versus Human and mid-game versus Orc. It might be too strong in the other matchups in the mirroring against Undead. Although this could be fine. I'm not entirely sure on this one, but it doesn't really seem to be helping on paper. Where it's needed, sort of. Sorry, allergies. Alright, Night Elf didn't get much here this patch. Now we move to Undead. And again here it's clear that Blizzard's priority with this patch seems to be addressing Undead versus Human, which is fair. Because this is the most problematic matchup, we all know that. So, Acolyte. Hit point regeneration while on Blight reduced from 4 to 3 HP. Developers notes, in a previous patch we saw the regen rated Blight double. Yeah, that was a long time ago. This was to address the vulnerability of the unit being exposed and stationary while mining gold. As the overall spirit of the game was heading in the right direction, we're reducing the numbers slightly to allow for more harassment opportunities from the opposing player. So I guess what this is trying to say in a roundabout way is, well, in the past we had too much economy harass, that was annoying. But nowadays we don't have enough, so let's weaken them some. Which I think is okay. Acolytes were ultra buffed before, with move speed, with armor, with HP regen. This is a little bit of a nerf. This is going to be slightly noticeable, and I think it's okay. With that, especially Undead expansion becomes more harassable again. Maybe the main, I'm not sure about that one yet. Problem is, this one, in conjunction with the tank buff, by the way, could again lead to a lot of harassment, drop the base with Blizzard and Flamestrike. Well, less so Flamestrike, but Blizzard and tanks, and a lot of lame possibly coming up. But I think this is a good change. This is a fair change, a little bit of a nerf to the Acolytes, that's fine. But definitely not with this one. This is still a very bad change that I would like to come back to for a second. But yeah, Acolyte, this is a good one, I would say. Rod of Necromancy cooldown reduced from 26 to 24 seconds. By the way, before the most recent Rod nerf, it was 22 seconds. So now it's in the middle, between 26 and 22. They now move it to 24. Developers notes, slight calibration of the previous change. We've noticed that this change has a more effect on undead creeping than intended, so we're reducing the this number slightly. Yeah. Ever since this change, almost all undeads have moved away from Ted Fiend openings because creeping is so slow with skeletons. And we see almost exclusively ghoul openings nowadays. So this is supposed to help with that. Also, This helps bring the power levels more in line again. The Crypt Lord was extremely strong and he could creep like crazy, whereas the other heroes had some serious problems, especially the Tet Fiend opening with DK and Skeletons only. So this should bring the first heroes in line a little bit more in terms of power level and creep efficiency. This is a good change. A very good change. Like this one a lot. Next one, Ritual Dagger, cost reduced from 125 to 100. I initially thought the healing amount also increased, but that's not correct. It's only the gold amount that was reduced. Developer notes say we're reducing the cost of Ritual Dagger to promote its use more and to bring its cost in line with its healing performance. Yeah, this is a good change. Ritual Dagger was a very weak item. It's still sort of weak, but it's a little bit better. Moving on. This is the big one. This is possibly the most important change of the patch. Crypt Lord Impale stun duration on heroes from 1 to 3 seconds to 1.5, 2 seconds. Yes, thank goodness. This was desperately needed. It was insane how much damage the Crypt Lord could do to armies, stun them, and also provide hero kill. So this has been reduced. And also the damage. This might be going slightly overboard, but I think it's fine. Impale is still a very good spell. Crypt Lord is still a very strong opening hero with a strong late game AoE spell. I've seen some people be very concerned, but I think this is very good. This is 100% needed, 100%. And this one is also fine, I would say. Anything else I want to say about that? Yeah, that's pretty much it. Also, this is the right way to do a change. This helps the problematic matchup. We see Crypt Lord all the time against human. It's a big problem there. It's a big imbalance there. He gets nerfed. That helps the problematic matchup. In Undead Mirror, he was also pretty oppressive. Helps over there a little bit as well. Against Orc, against Night Elf, Crypt Lord, not really an issue. If the Orc especially knows how to play against it. So, next change coming up, Frost Armor. And this is the big one. And this is the big one that concerns me and makes me wonder, how deep are they really considering these changes? But okay, let's first get into what it says. Frost Armor duration is now scaled per level. Frost duration 2 seconds on level 1, 4 seconds level 2, 3 seconds level 6. What this means is, when there's a Frost Armor active on a unit and it gets attacked, that attacking unit is going to be slowed for 2, 4, 6 seconds. At the moment, it is 4 seconds on every level. Developer notes say this was something that the community has been requesting for some time and addresses the early power spike against melee units, while still allowing the ability to scale up as the Lich levels up. This tuning makes the ability slightly worse at level 1, the same as it currently is at level 2, and better at level 3. Alright. There's a few things to be said here. So, firstly, this is a nerf to Frost Armor, and with that to all matchups for Undead. Frost Armor is used everywhere, except for the Mirror matchup, but there it doesn't really matter in terms of balance. Frost Armor is prevalent and crucial everywhere. It says a slight nerf from level 1, on level 1. Going from a 4-second slow to a 2-second slow is not a slight nerf. That is a 50% nerf on the slow duration. Especially when you're playing kiting units, aka fiends, that's a massive deal. This is a monstrous nerf. This is not a slight nerf by any means. But a little bit more on that in a second. First of all, nerfing Frost Armor to address one problematic matchup against Undead is like nerfing Moonwells to deal with one matchup for Night Elves. Frost Armor is needed everywhere. It's used everywhere. To nerf it for one matchup is the wrong approach. It's absolutely the wrong approach. As I said, it's crucial everywhere, and the Undeads need it. Undead is a race that relies on tier 3. Is in a one-base scenario pretty much useless on tier 2 compared to the other races. So they need to get to tier 3 fast. And one way that is ensured is with a strong level 1 Lich with Frost Armor. Especially against Orc, perhaps less so against Human. But especially against Orc, this is a massive, massive nerf. Playing Fiends versus Orc and Knights is already extremely hard. With this nerf, it will be pretty much impossible. And also, it's not like Frost Armor has no counterplay. It can be dealt with, either with very detailed micro, like pretending to attack unit, then going for another one, but that is very, very tough to do. But also, there's the spell you can use against it. It's not like this is impossible to micro against. And yeah, this is not a small nerf by any means. And the thing is, level 2 Frost Armor you will only get with level 4 Lich, because you always have to get 2 levels of Frost Nova. So, this is a very weird decision, and it leaves me almost grasping for air at how weirdly placed it is. I think one concern here for the developers is that the skill is such a one-point wonder. On level 1 is extremely good, then on level 2 and level 3 it hardly improves. Yeah, that's true. But if it's part of the game and it holds up the balance, you have to leave it in. This slow duration keeps Undead competitive in the mid-game, especially against Orc. Again, reducing the slow duration from 4 seconds to 2 seconds, that is a massive nerf. A massive nerf. And it's not just for the mid-game with Fiends, also for the late game to protect the heroes against hero focus from the Orc and from the human. It's already extremely hard to play that kiting game, and with this, it will be made almost impossible. So this is... I think this change is actually worse than the tag change. I think this change is truly horrible. This change is truly horrible, and it has to be reverted. Bears are also getting buffed, so that's another problem. Lich Frost Armor is nowadays also a staple against Night Elf. Bears getting buffed is also going to weaken Undead there. It's going to weaken Undead in every matchup massively. Massively. This... I don't want to be hurtful anyway or whatever. Don't want to attack anybody who designed this. But this is a horrible change. This must be reverted. Alright, moving on. Boneyard no longer requires a sacrificial pit. We currently believe it takes too long for Frostworms to see play. This change should allow players to find strategies to use Frostworms worms, by the way, and should also help in conjunction to the night change in this patch. Yeah, it makes sense. You know, hopefully this encourages a bit more diverse play to see the exotic units. Frostworms, one of the most rarely used unit in the game. But it probably still will only ever really be usable against Night Elf. Because the big problem with Frostworms is they're very expensive, they're hard to get to, and despite their high HP, they're sort of easy to kill. Why? Because they can get controlled very easily. Orcs with Ensnare and piercing damage from Berserkers can take him out very easily, or maybe with Hex. Undead with Fiend, Focus Fire, and with Web can snipe them very quickly as well. Human with either Aerial Shackle from Dragonhawks, or Gyros, or Stormbolt can deal with them also pretty well. The only race that cannot disable, control, and counter them very effectively is Night Elf. So, against Night Elf actually, this could be helpful. Against Bears actually, this could be helpful. But against Knights, not really. It's still a good change, it encourages a bit more diverse play, and it shouldn't make them OP by any stretch of the imagination. So before we get into the items, we're going to stay with the races for a little bit longer. Obviously, this patch is mainly designed to address Undead versus Human, and as I said many times now, I think it should be, because that matchup is definitely imbalanced at the moment. But keep in mind, you don't want to overbuff and overnerf things too much for the pendulum to just swing back and be just as imbalanced as it was before. So let's take a quick tally here. What do we have? We have 5 human buffs. This is a big one for the macro. This is a big one for the timing. This is a pretty good one for the priest and ease of use. This is a big one defensively and possibly aggressively for unwanted strategies. This is a big buff for really annoying, non-fun, frustrating strategies. So these are 5 meaningful, significant buffs for human, all of which are applicable to the matchup against Undead. Maybe this one a little bit less. And then for Undead, we have 1 nerf, which is definitely significant because human oftentimes likes to go Acolyte hunting. We have a bit of a buff here, which will help out the Undead early game against human a little bit, to be frank. Ritual Dagger, not really meaningful at all. Big nerf to the Crypt Lord. Big nerf and needed nerf to the Crypt Lord. Massive nerf to the Frost Armor, which is unwarranted and possibly destructive to Undead. And then here a buff that is a slight transition improvement for units that are not really playable against human, aka Frostworms. Frostworms are actually the worst unit you can play against human. Even Necromancers are better. In fact, Necros can be OP, but let's not get into that now. Alright, so I think the tally here is human is getting too much, and Undead is getting too many buffs, and Undead is getting a fair amount of nerfs, with the exception of this one. So it's 5 human buffs, 3 small Undead buffs, but rather insignificant ones, and 3 very significant Undead nerfs. For the most part, I think that's fine, but Frost Armor has to be reverted. This is too much. And also, tanks. Where is it? Tanks has to be reverted. This is not good. This is potentially very harmful to the game. Towers, I would also say, should be reverted. But this is the least egregious of the 3. Alright. That would be my final statement for the Undead versus Human matchup and for these patch notes. We're not completely done yet, though, because we also have item changes, and these are quite interesting. First of all the aura items are getting nerfed. And I think that's very good. Aura items from creep camps have been way too good for way too long. So now all aura items get nerfed by 25%. Very good choice, Blizzard. With that, they have different values than the actual auras from the heroes. But I think that's fine. I think that's good. This should make item power levels way more in line with each other and move away from RNG and from unfair mechanics that can decide a game. Very good. Very, very good. And the second one, and this is one I've actually been asking for a long time, along with Todd, along with other people. Todd was actually the first one to come up with this idea. All items resale percentage increased from 50% to 75% of the item's total cost. So at the moment, the way it works is the item you find or buy, you can sell for 50% of the value. For example, a big healing potion that you find, you can sell at the moment for 200 gold. With this, it would be 300 gold. And you can buy those at a marketplace for 400 gold, by the way. Developer notes say, these are probably the biggest changes in this patch. I'm not so sure about that, but okay. We're making some changes to all the aura items to reduce their effectiveness. We believe that these aura items do have a place in the game, but should not have parity and power to the actual hero ability. Also, due to the nature of some items being more impactful than others, we're increasing the sell rate of items to help mitigate some potential bad item luck that players may experience, which can ultimately determine the outcome of some games. Yes, I definitely agree with this. Philosophically, I agree with this a lot. I agree with all of this. But in execution, we have a real problem here. So, we need to go through a few things here. We all know aura items are very good. They were way too good for way too long. The fact that you could get Khadgar's Pipe against a +4/+4 item was ridiculous, but the +4 items now are better, the auras are weaker, very good. We're closing the gap. Excellent. Gold sell value is good. Increasing it is good. Because the thing is, in Warcraft, finding bad items will always be part of the game. No matter how well we balance the items out, there's always going to be game scenarios where some items are good, some are bad. There's just no way around it. The way you mitigate this is by increasing sell value to reduce the impact, the negative impact that RNG can have for a player. So again, philosophically, this is Very, very good. But increasing it to 75%, that's a lot. That is a tremendous amount. Like, it just looks like 25% maybe. Maybe it doesn't look like that much on paper, but it's actually a sell increase, a value increase of 50%. 50%. That is absolutely massive. So as I just mentioned in the example, big healing potion. If you find it at the moment, you can sell it for 200 gold. Finding it in the future on the PTR, you can sell it for 300. 50% increase. Now this has a few issues. First of all, this might lead to the game being mostly about hunting items, selling items, and then just building an army, going for a timing, and trying to finish the game. That's not the kind of game that we want to have. We want to have a game where items are still good, and players want to fight for items, and keep the items, and strengthen their army and heroes, but just get a little bit more from selling if they do have to sell them because they're bad. But if you can now sell them for 50% more, that is so much gold. If you get a Scroll of the Beast, usually you think, with my rifle army, that's pretty good. I think I'm going to keep it. Maybe I can use it later at a strategic moment for a good impact to then have a strong push. But if you get 300 gold from it, we're going to see a lot of items being sold all the time. And items are a fun factor of the game. We want them to be valuable and to be kept if they're useful, but to be sold if they're useless. So 75, I think, is way too much. I'm going to get to the number that I think it should be here in a second. Second problem with this is Scroll of Town Portal with this value can currently be sold on the PTR for 262 gold. Normally it sells for 175. With this, it sells for 262 gold. That is insane. That is way too high. That's game breaking. Some strategies sell the TP right away, especially Orc. Every Blade Master opening sells the TP to get more slots for heal cells and circlet and speed scroll and all that. And also Undead fast expansion strategies sell the TP right away at the shop and then go fast expand. If they suddenly can sell it for 262 gold, I don't use that word in a sensationalistic way. It really is game-breaking. 262 gold at the beginning is insane and might just lead to all people suddenly starting to sell their TP. So this is way too high in general, and especially with the TP, hugely problematic. So, how do we solve this? In my opinion, 2 steps. First of all, this 75% is too high. Again, the idea is the right one, but the execution is too heavy-handed. So I think it should just be increasing it from 50 to 60%. That is still a good increase. That is still encouraging or helping with bad luck, with bad RNG for one player, but it doesn't make things crazy. Again, as an example, if you find a wand of mana stealing and you can't use it, you can sell it and get a little bit more gold. Now instead of 200 gold, you get 240. 240, that's reasonable, but 300, that's extreme. That's extreme. Way too extreme if you ask me. So 60 instead of 75 should be the way to go. Secondly, the TP issue remains a problem. If you sell the 350 gold TP for 60%, that's still a lot of gold, still a bit too much. So I think also TP gold cost should be reduced from 350 to 325. Over the course of a long game, when you have to rebuy a TP, those 25 gold don't matter so much. But in the very beginning, especially for fast expansions and for Blade Masters, having that little bit less gold that you get from selling it makes a difference. So, again, making this 60 instead of 75% should be the way to go. And also decreasing the TP gold cost from 350 to 325 gold. And then I think we should be good. Then I think we should be golden, and we should be in a really good place with item balance. The best we've ever had by far. Towards the end of the patch notes, this is the last one, a bug fix is mentioned that was very much needed. Not all of you know what exactly this means, but basically the way it worked is with some trickery with rally points and shift Q, you could figure out where an opponent spawned, which was a big problem and basically a cheating mechanic. And now it's going to be removed, which is very good. This is another very good change that they are implementing here, and a needed one. All right, so now we went through the patch notes. You all got a good look at them. But these are just the ones that were mentioned. There's also a few things that were not mentioned. So I'm going to come back to the beginning of the video. 3 things were important, should be important in this next balance update coming up. Undead versus human, which was obviously addressed. Human versus Night Elf, ultra late game, which was not really addressed. And Orc being a bit too efficient nowadays, which has really become visible over the last half year, which was not addressed at all. In fact, we have 0 Orc changes, which is kind of weird considering that they are probably the strongest race at the moment. So, first point, Undead versus human. Overall, it's mostly good. It's going in the right direction, but it's too heavy-handed in many regards. As I mentioned earlier, we need to revert the tank nerf, the tank buff, excuse me. We need to revert the frost armor nerf, and we should probably also not go through with the tower buff, as those could be really harmful to the game. The tower buff could be harmful, and especially the tank buff could be really hurtful, really harmful to the game. And the frost armor nerf would just destroy Undead mid-game. Absolutely devastating, horrible change. That one cannot go through. So, second point, human versus Undead, human versus Night Elf ultra late game. As I said, not addressed. I said this a couple of times, but it is true. Once human is stable on 2 bases, they get to their 80 supply, they have the strong heroes and the strong army, they are almost impossible for Night Elf to beat. The primary reason is, yeah, they have a very cost-efficient army, but also they have very, very powerful spells. Clamp, Slow, and Inner Fire are extremely strong. Night Elf has nothing that compares. Mana Burn, Quill Beasts, Entangle, Dryad Dispel, Roar. These are all spells that are not remotely on the same power level of the humans, which is why usually human in the ultra late game is so favored. So what Night Elf needs is a specific buff that helps them in this matchup in the ultra late game. That doesn't make them too strong in other matchups, but helps them specifically here. And I think the way to do it is through 2 ways. First, buff the Panda, and secondly, buff Fairy Dragon's Mana Flare form. The Pandaren Brewmaster is the only real hero that Night Elves can use as any sort of powerful AoE. That can be very impactful late game with big armies, where Night Elf struggles against human. And also, Night Elf can have a lot of issues against mass rifle play, with double barracks play from the human side. The Panda, with his AoE, would help there as well, especially in the late game, where the Panda excels. Panda can also be played against Undead, and maybe against Orc, although there it's hard to do. But normally, he never gets to level 5, or very rarely, and shouldn't be a big problem there. So, buffing the Panda, I think, is the right approach, and that should be through, number 1, buffing his base stats with +1 strength and +1 intelligence right off the bat. That doesn't help Panda so much in the late game, but it helps him be stable in the mid game and help him creep and accelerate towards the late game. So first of all, buff his stats, +1 strength, +1 int, and also increase the damage cap of level 2 and level 3 Breath of Fire by 10%. Breath of Fire has a damage cap. Once you hit enough units to do enough damage, the damage stops. So you cannot do infinite damage, which is important. But I think that cap should be raised again to help in the ultra late game against the massive human army where Night Elf needs help. So that's the first one, Panda buff. And the second is buff Fairy Dragons, or buff their Mana Flare form. Fairy Dragons are really cool units. They're really cool anti-casters. They morph into a Mana Flare form, and then they cast Mana Flare, which damages units that cast spells. And the way it works is for every point of mana that units use, they damage them for 3 damage. Heroes for 1. I think this should be increased from 3 damage per mana to 4 damage per mana to give them more damage against casters. It would be a significant buff, but I think a proper one. And the nice thing here is also you can counterplay that. You can move away from fairy dragons. And of course there's counters to fairies in the first place with gyrocopters and riflemen. And secondly, also I think increasing the max damage of Mana Flare form could be appropriate. At the moment, max damage is 90, which means no matter how much spell a caster uses, it can never do more than 90 damage. That could also be increased to 100 or maybe 95. A little bit of an increase there, I think would also be good. But in turn, with this damage increase on Mana Flare form, their normal attack damage should be reduced to 13 to 14. At the moment, I think it's 15 to 16 or something like that. But that should be reduced from to 13 to 14. Because what we don't want to have is just mass fairy dragons and mass magic immune units consisting of nothing else but those for the army. Because we have learned mass magic immune armies are very annoying, very unfun, and lead to a very dull meta. Mass destroyers, mass dryads, mass breakers is not what we want to have. We don't want to have mass fairy dragons. So decrease their attack damage to make them properly scaled if we increase their Mana Flare form damage. And with those 2 changes, I think that should be helping Night Elf late game a lot. So that's the second point. We talked about Undead versus Human, which is important. We talked about Human versus Night Elf, which is important. And now the third one, Orc cost efficiency. And that one also was not addressed at all. And I don't blame Blizzard too much for this, because the strength of Orc and their cost efficiency has only really been noticed and discovered lately, with how good Orc has been doing, with how well Orc has been using the buffs of the Great Hall and of Mirror Image, I suppose, but especially of the Great Hall. So, yeah, we saw it in DreamHack Asia. We saw it in the Huya Master League. Orc is really, really strong right now. It's not very clear in EU and NA at all. In NA, sort of, because Hitman is so strong, but Hitman has always been so strong. In Europe, we have no orcs on the top level at all. But that is honestly just because we don't have very strong orcs in Europe that try to compete on a very high level. Orcs in Asia are absolutely killing it. Focus, Fly, Lin, absolutely destroying everyone. And a bit of a nerf is in order. And here, rarely, we could try to implement a nerf that reaches across the board. Not a big one, but a small one. Move in increments so it doesn't overbuff or overnerf anything. And I think the obvious choice here is scroll of speed. Scroll of speed has been super strong for a long, long time. And I think, honestly, way too strong. The fact that a 50 gold item can win you a fight in the early game, mid game, late game, doesn't matter. The item has insane value and is super strong, one of the biggest strengths that Orc has. So speed scroll should be addressed here, I think, to knock down Orc a little bit the way it is appropriate. And the way to do it is the gold cost, I believe. At the moment 50 gold, if you just raise that from 50 to 70 gold, then we should be good. And then take a look at how it goes and reassess in a future point. And with that, I think we can address all the issues that haven't been addressed yet. To recap once more, Human versus Undead, Blizzard tried to address, but there's some things that have to be changed there. Human versus Night Elf, ultra late game. There has to be something done there. Night Elf has to get some help in the ultra late game. I mentioned what I think would be good. Panda and fairy dragons. And Orc being too cost efficient has to be curbed a little bit as well. Raise the scroll of speed cost from 50 to 70 gold. And that is pretty much it, I think. Is there anything else I want to say? No, I tried to keep the video short, but suddenly we're at 1 hour again. Somehow it always takes me a while. But if you still managed to stay here until the very end, thank you guys very much for sticking it out. Again, I'm going to be posting the link to this PTR change lockdown in the description, and let us know what you think. Post here in the comment section, and if you're really determined, go to the Reddit, go to the Blizzard forums, and contribute there as well. State your opinions, ideally with some facts or some backup to give some feedback there, because Blizzard is very clearly looking for feedback. And again, I would try to remind everyone that this is about making the game as healthy as possible. We want to have fair matchups across the board. We don't just want to have our race being strong. Especially on Twitter, I've been seeing quite a few people lobbying for their race again, and that seems good short term if you end up being the one with a strong race, but honestly, it's bad for the game long term if we have races overpowered. As you guys know, I'm an Undead player, but I know Crypt Lord Impale has to be nerfed. Acolyte regen rate, I'm fine with that as well, that getting nerfed, but especially Impale had to be nerfed, and it did. But Frost Armor, that is gonna kill Undead, actually. That's gonna kill Undead. So we need to keep an open mind here and try to make the game as healthy as possible. And I hope we can achieve that. I'm going to be looking forward to the new iterations of the PTR. I would assume in 1 week, maybe 2, Blizzard is going to be adjusting, is going to be updating. And yeah, give your feedback and let them know what you think. Alright, that's it. Thank you all for tuning in, and see you again soon here. Remo signing out, and yeah, take care.